listening to the Decidedly podcast with Sanger Smith and Sean Smith. Our mission is to help business owners like you defeat bad decision making so you can improve your health, wealth, and relationships. We do this by digging deep into the stories and expertise of our guests and distilling their knowledge into actionable wisdom for you to carry into your life and business. If you're new to the show, welcome. Be sure to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. If you prefer to watch this week's episode, head on over to YouTube for the full video. Now, let's get into this week's episode and defeat bad decision making in your life and business.
When I first started my career, I was really poor, and that's the story for a lot of people, I think. You know, right after college, you don't have a lot of money, kind of starting to just figure out how adulthood works. You have all these new bills. And so I made things really extreme on myself. One, out of fear, I probably acted poorer than I was, but also I just didn't have any money. So I never left anything plugged in beyond when I was done using it. So every time I wanted to watch TV, the entire TV had to reboot because it wasn't plugged in. So I'd plug it in, it would completely reboot. And then it took like 15 minutes later, I could watch something. Same thing with like my toaster, my blender, and all these things, my lamp, everything. I thought that saved me money. I kept the blinds completely down all day long. I never had any natural sun in my apartment because that kept the heating bill, or the AC rather. I kept the AC bill low. And in Texas, it could get pretty high. And I pretty much ate exclusively ramen noodles. Now, part of that is because I didn't have any money. Part of it's because I didn't know how to cook. But I just got ramen noodles at the beginning of the week, and I'd eat these, bulk pack of ramen all week long. So my grandmother came over to visit me from time to time. She lives in Fort Worth, and every time she did, I had ramen noodles. And she noticed that. And I guess she really thought I liked ramen noodles because that year for Christmas, I got an exotic pack of ramen noodles. I got like all types of different specialty ramens. I got my very own pair of chopsticks, which I still use when I get sushi. And it was so funny to me because she didn't see it as a problem. She didn't see that I was struggling. She just thought I really liked ramen. And now I don't really trust anyone that hasn't had some period of their life where they've been forced to eat ramen. Speaking of only eating ramen, our guest today, she definitely struggled through that phase of her life in a much more extreme way than I ever have. Suzanne Heywood has an amazing story. When she was only 7 years old, her family set out to sail around the world. And what she thought was going to be a 3-year journey ended up being almost a 10-year journey of living exclusively on a boat with her family and strange crew who she didn't know. She finally found her escape from that boat, went to Oxford University, subsequently got a PhD from Cambridge, worked in the UK Treasury, became a consultant with McKinsey, and now she's the chief operating officer for one of Europe's largest holding companies, Exor. She has a magnificent, triumphant story from being isolated, excluded, and trapped in a world where she had no agency in future, breaking free from that and building a life not only of meaning, but of significance. So you feel like you're trapped on your own boat of sorts. This podcast is right for you. I'm Sanger, and this is Decidedly. Suzanne, I used to think my family is a little crazy, and a lot of people say that about their family because we get a little rowdy at Thanksgiving or whatever. But I think your family, I think you can wear that label really honestly. Y'all set out on a voyage to sail around the world when you were how old?
When I was 7 years old.
7. So that's young enough to where did you have any questions for your parents at that point about the wisdom of such an excursion, or were you just immediately up for it?
Well, my father announced it when I was 6 years old. And I do remember having questions. I mean, my questions were the obvious ones that a 6-year-old would have, like, how long are we going to be away? Because I was worried about leaving all my friends behind. And what can I take with me? Turned out not very much. I basically could only take my teddy bear and my favorite dress. So I had to leave behind things like my beloved doll's house that I thought about and wrote about for kind of years afterwards. And my dog. We had a wonderful kind of water spaniel called Rusty, who we had to leave behind. So how long are we going to be gone for?
Oh, you had to bail on the dog.
Had to bail on the dog. I know. We might come back to Rusty later and what happened to Rusty. But I was very, very close to him. So we had to leave the dog, leave the doll's house, leave all my friends. But you know what my father said was, this is going to be a fantastic adventure. We're going to be away for 3 years. You're going to see places none of your friends will have seen. And then you're going to come back. You'll be 10 years old and you're going to go back to school and everything's going to go back to normal, but you will have had this incredible adventure.
Okay, somewhat compelling. I think I would have been mostly concerned with, does Santa still visit the boat? How does that work?
Yeah, we asked that question. I'm not sure if we asked that question when we left, because we left in July, but we certainly asked that question as kind of Christmas approached. And the answer was, Santa will tie his sleigh to the top of the mast, and then he'll come down the mast, but he'll still come.
Okay, that's good. He always finds a way, doesn't he?
He does always find a way.
That's kind of the appeal of that guy. So what do you think? What was your, obviously as a 6-year-old, when you hear the news, 7-year-old, when you actually take off on the boat, you don't have a whole lot of say in the matter. But were you enthusiastic? Were you reluctantly going along with it? Or were you totally rebelling from it?
I think that at the point at which we left, as I remember it, I was quite enthusiastic. I mean, like a lot of little girls, I hero worshipped my father. I thought he was an incredible sailor. I hadn't been a lot sailing with him, but I had a couple of times, and I completely trusted that he was a wonderful sailor. This was going to be a great adventure, he kept on telling me. And of course, my mother was going to be there and my younger brother. So I don't think I really questioned it. And I was told it was going to be a fantastic adventure. So, I was definitely going to be part of it. I was worried about everything I was leaving behind, but I don't think I really kind of pushed back at all about leaving.
So it's you, mom, dad, younger brother. Did you have any other siblings?
No, I've only got one sibling who's a bit younger than me. But when we set sail, we had 3 crew on board, one of which had actually crossed an ocean before. The other 2 had not, and my father had not either.
Okay, so this was an adventure for everybody. This was a totally new thing for everyone.
It certainly was. My father had never crossed an ocean. He taught himself how to navigate, because in those days, of course, you didn't have satellite navigation. We're talking about the late 70s. So you had to navigate by taking the angle between the sun and the horizon. So he taught himself how to do that, but he'd never really done it. So it was an adventure for everybody.
Yeah. What a place to learn when you're crossing the Atlantic, right? What was his motivation at that time? I mean, of course, he's presenting it as this amazing, wonderful adventure. Was there anything deeper to that motivation from his point of view?
It's interesting. I spent a lot of time thinking about this, because growing up on a boat is a little bit like growing up in a cult, because you don't have any external view of, what the purpose is of your life. So there was a narrative that I was given, and this was the narrative that stayed pretty consistent, at least for the first part of the voyage. And the narrative was that we were sailing around the world, following Captain Cook around the world. And I should explain for your listeners at this point that my maiden name is Cook. Now, we're not actually related, I now know, although as a small child, I always thought that we were. But anyway, it turns out we're not. But that was enough of an excuse. My father wanted to sail around the world, follow Captain Cook, and we actually set sail from England on the 200th anniversary of his 3rd voyage.
Okay.
Now, so there was a bit of
neat.
that was kind of neat. And he managed to raise a bit of money for the voyage, because I should say we weren't a wealthy family particularly. So he managed to raise a bit of money on the back of that. Now, as an adult, looking back and really thinking about it and reading, stuff that he's written and, stuff others have written, I think a lot of it was that he wanted to be seen as a hero. This was him creating a kind of purpose in his life.
Yeah.
And the Captain Cook narrative, although it was the kind of narrative that I grew up with, as we'll see, as the kind of voyage went on, it became more and more apparent that that really wasn't something that he was sticking to.
Okay. So it was more so an excuse to make the whole ordeal happen, but going around the world was that still the main objective, and maybe following the path secondary? Or
so I think following the path was the big reason that he could give, and it was a way to get sponsorship for the voyage. So it created a kind of purpose for the voyage. But I think one level deeper than that is he wanted to be a hero. He wanted to be this man who'd kind of sailed a boat around the world with his kind of family, and he wanted to be able to kind of boast about that and kind of make that a heroic achievement. It wasn't that long after we'd had a whole series of sailing heroes which have been very big in the UK, kind of Francis Chichester and all of those, Robin Knox Johnson. They'd all done big sailing exploits, and I think my father may have been very motivated by that to try and do something similar and become famous.
How much of this do you think your mom was aware of at that time?
So my mother certainly knew and understood the Captain Cook narrative, and she knew that my father was passionate about sailing. And I think it was very obvious probably to another adult early on that he loved the media side of this. He loved giving kind of interviews and all of that sort of thing. Whether or not she really understood his kind of underlying motivation, which is, I mean, I'm not him, so I don't know for sure either.
Sure.
I don't know. But whatever it was, my parents were always incredibly close, and there was never any doubt that my mother would go on this voyage as well, despite the fact that it became very clear early on that she got terribly seasick and she hated sailing.
Oh, what a time to figure that out.
Well, I think she knew before we left that she didn't like sailing, and she knew that she got seasick. I don't know if she knew how seasick she got, but certainly every time we left a port, my mother would be seasick for several days and would retreat to her bunk and not come back out. And that, it's a huge sacrifice for someone to make.
That's a massive
in order
sacrifice.
For somebody else to, yeah.
And especially because I'm imagining, there's times where it's not just hours, it's not just days, it's weeks before you're, throwing that anchor down again and getting off onto dry land.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we set sail from England, from the south coast of England, and our first real kind of destination, we stopped very briefly in Madeira and the Canary Islands, but our first real destination was South America. And that is 6 to 7 weeks at sea.
Yeah.
Not seeing anything apart from sea.
I mean, not even another boat.
No, we saw one other boat. As we approached, there was a boat going the other way. But that's it. You don't, and of course, we didn't have a radio that you could use to, have any sort of conversation. So no communication with anybody. It's like being in a bubble for 6-7 weeks, surviving storms, running short of food. I mean, by the time we got to South America, we were running very short of food. We'd obviously had no fresh food left whatsoever. And even the kind of canned and dried food was running very short.
Yeah, that was on my mind as soon as you said 7 weeks. I mean, how do you pack that? How big is this boat? If you've got a family of 4, crew of 3, so there's 7 people, now you got to have food and you got to have water for 7 people for 7 weeks. I mean, I just look at like my trash bin every Wednesday and it's full to the brim. It's just me and my wife. How do you pack all that on a boat?
Well, so Wave Walker, which is the name of the boat, the Wave Walker was 69 feet long. So quite long for a boat, but very thin. So a long, thin boat.
Does that make it sway more in the water than like a catamaran would or something like that?
Yes. So a catamaran tends to be very stable on the water, whereas a monohull, just a kind of single hull boat, heels over quite a lot. It doesn't sway that much. So when it depends which way the wind's going and which way you're sailing against the wind, but it will lean over, if you like. It will heel over quite a long way. So most of the time you're living with your world tilted over on one side, and obviously
because it's going to
go back and
it's
forth.
going to sail kind of on an edge for a long period. It's not just going to stay there and then kind of like wobble to an even spot. It's going to go. What's the advantage of that? Is it because it's faster? It can turn quicker?
Well, basically, it's just the effect of the sails. So imagine, you've got the wind filling the sails. The sails are pushing the boat over onto its side. So that is how, it's just the pressure of the wind on the boat. You then have a lot of lead on the keel, which stops the boat kind of going all the way over. So it gets to a kind of stable point. But it kind of generally sails on an angle. So down below, you're living on that angle with your world tilted on one side, and of course not being still, because it tends to rock forward backwards as it's going through the waves, but on an angle. And then every so often you will tack, and that means you take the boat round the other way, so the sails go the other way round. And then down below, what happens is the whole cabin tilts from one way to the other way, and then you're living on the other way.
And all your soup pours out and everything.
Well, everything kind of falls off. But also, you're living your life at, sometimes a kind of 45-degree or more angle. And even little jobs like climbing out of your bunk in the morning. If you're trying to climb out of your bunk and the whole room is on a 45-degree angle, that's pretty hard to do, particularly if you're a little kid. Even walking through the cabins is quite difficult. So you're at sea for 6-7 weeks. By the time you get to land, it's a very strange experience getting back on land again. For a start off, it feels like the land is swaying because all of a sudden you're not used to it. I remember when we got to Rio de Janeiro, which is where we stopped in South America, we couldn't cross the road because we couldn't work out how fast the traffic was going. You'd lost your ability to do that.
Wow. So this is like immediately you're in this disorienting experience, and the disorientation lasts for much longer. There was no gradual build up. You had done this, with your dad, but I'm guessing these are like day trips on sailing, not, hey, we're going to start with a week, we're going to build up to 2 weeks or anything like that. What about the crew? How well did you know them as a kid before the trip started?
I didn't know them very well. We've been on a couple of trial sails. But the other thing that I should say is the crew kept changing. So that was the crew for the first leg of the voyage down to South America.
Oh, okay. I was wondering, like, who the heck is signing up for 3 years with this family?
Well, that was one of the things. When my father first told me he was going to sail around the world, he said he had some friends who were going to go with us all the way. All those friends pulled out because they realized that actually this was a very dangerous voyage. Yeah. Because one of the consequences of following Captain Cook around the world, which is what my father wanted to do, was we were actually sailing the wrong way around the world. So most people, if they sail around the world, they sail from east to west. And that means that you can sail near the equator because the wind's behind you going east to west. But Captain Cook, for all sorts of other reasons, decided to go the other way. He went from west to east. Okay. And in order to go from west to east, you've got to go really far south. So that meant that when we left South America, by which point we only had one of the original crew on board and another woman had joined, we had to cross the very southern Atlantic Ocean. And that was a very rough trip. I described that in my book about the voyage. It was incredibly rough, huge waves, and we lost the compass. The compass stopped working halfway across, and that was a kind of a major moment because then you don't know where you are.
Yeah, how in the world was that not just the end of it right there? How do you even survive losing the compass?
Well, it almost was the end of it. Luckily, we had a tiny plastic compass that we managed to find that was stored up in the bow. But it was a very, it was nowhere near as accurate. So for a while we thought we were stuck, but then we found that. We eventually got to South Africa, sailing the wrong way around the world. But it was the next trip, which was South Africa to Australia, that was far more dangerous. That probably is the Southern Indian Ocean is probably the most dangerous ocean in the world. And halfway across that ocean, the waves became bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually the boat was hit by an enormous wave that was 3 times as big as our mainmast. And our mainmast was about 30 foot, so like a 90-foot wave that smashed through the deck of the boat and out through the side of the boat. And as a little girl, I'm still 7 years old, I was flung against the roof of the cabin and against the wall, fractured my skull, broke my nose. And the boat starts filling with water because we have a huge hole in it by then. And we are incredibly lucky to 3 days later find a tiny little island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, Isle Amsterdam. But unfortunately, there wasn't very much on this island apart from a small French military base. There was a doctor and he operated on me, but unfortunately they had no anesthetic. So I think that was the moment when I realized this was this wasn't a fun adventure. This was actually an incredibly dangerous undertaking that my father had brought us into doing.
Yeah, that had to be incredibly painful.
Yeah. I describe it, and it's interesting that there's a chapter in my book which I call The Wave. And I remember I wrote the first version of it and I showed it to another author. And she said, "You've written this chapter like you have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
How could you not?
How could you not?" And then she said, you need to break through that. You need to kind of take us as a reader into what it was really like to be a little girl in this boat. Of course, you don't know what's happening. You're being thrown around this cabin and you're not in control. Most stories like this are written from the perspective of the captain up on the wheel. He's deciding, usually he deciding what, but I'm down below. And I did. I eventually kind of broke through that kind of barrier and wrote that. I had nightmares for several days afterwards, but hopefully I won't give kind of people reading the book nightmares, but it was incredibly scary what happened. And then the operations were incredibly painful. But even when you put all that to one side, what it did was it changed my whole perspective on this voyage.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. And it sounds like you were incredibly aware of what was happening at 7 years old. How much of this were you aware of versus like found out after the fact? Were your parents kind of protecting you, keeping you from information, or were you in on it?
So my parents, and I do just try to describe this when I kind of wrote about it. I did grow up in a world where my parents had a very deliberate narrative of what was happening. So they would give me information, but it was a very filtered version of the information. So unfortunately, the wave and the accident that happened to us was not something we were ever able to discuss. We were banned from talking about it as children because my father would say, you can't talk about it because it upsets your mother. And that was the case with anything that went wrong on the boat. We were not allowed to talk about it. But when I came to write my story, I did have a number of different sources to go to, as well as my own kind of memories. And I have very vivid memories of it, as I think people who've been through kind of quite traumatic events often do. I had my mother's diary of that time. My father actually wrote an article in the Reader's Digest about the wave, and then he wrote his own account of it in his book. So I did have multiple different sources I could go to when I came to write about it. But as a child, I didn't have access to any of that. That was actually, I was banned from kind of talking about it. And, therefore, it was only as an adult that I was able to go back and really understand it.
Wow. Yeah. In some ways, there's no aspect of our childhood we can properly understand without the context of our own adult knowledge and wisdom. What's what's so striking to me is I'm hearing you describe all of these experiences. I'm imagining a little 7-year-old girl, and there's nothing that I would consider to be normal childhood experiences that are a part of this. Like, you obviously don't have other schoolyard friends on this boat. Did you have toys? Was there room for you to play and be a kid and use your imagination on?
So not a lot. So we obviously didn't have any friends. There was just me and my brother. In terms of toys, all we really had was we had some kind of stuffed animals. You know, I had a kind of teddy bear and various other kind of stuffed animals. Not very much else. And then when we were shipwrecked, basically all the toys that we did have, such as we had, they all got washed away. The only toy that survived was my small teddy bear survived. We were lucky because we did get quite a lot of press coverage when we finally got to Australia after the accident, and an incredibly kind man whose family owned a toy factory turned up down at the boatyard one day and brought a bag of toys for my brother and me. I remember it included for me another bear. So I had kind of 2 teddy bears, which was rather kind of wonderful. But that, as we went on, because we kept sailing, my father was not at all kind of deflected by this accident. As time went on and I became older, still trapped on this boat, that became a bigger and bigger issue, the lack of friends. Because I think as a little child, you can manage. You know, I used to make up imaginary games and imaginary worlds. But as you get older, you want friendships. And we kept on sailing, and I become 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I'm still on this boat, and I become desperately kind of lonely and, in need of having friendships, but also in need of school, because we're not really getting any proper schooling on this boat either.
Yeah. What did you do all day long?
Well, as I became older, I was expected to work quite a lot on the boat. So there's a lot of work that's required. We had run completely out of money by the time we got to me being kind of 12 or 13 because of the accident. And so we started taking paying crew on the boat, usually men who wanted to kind of have a holiday and learn how to sail. So we started sharing the boat with 6, 7, 8 crew. And my job was to cook and clean with my mother. So I was kind of working most of the days with her. But what I really wanted to do, what I was desperate to do, was to go to school, have friends, do all the kind of normal, boring things that a kid would do. And this is one of the kind of really interesting kind of inconsistencies of my childhood, which I try to kind of explain, which is I'm living in a beautiful place. I mean, by this point, we've got all the way up to Hawaii from Australia, and then we're sailing down through the South Pacific because my father decides not to come back to the UK and instead to keep on sailing with no end date to this voyage by this point. So I'm living in a beautiful place. But the reality of my world is that I'm trapped on this boat with these crew. I'm working a lot each day. I can't go to school. I can't have friendships. And my relationship with my mother is deteriorating. And I'm just desperate to escape, getting increasingly desperate to escape.
How did you even become aware of these things that you were missing? Because you have no movies, you have no friends, you're spending the vast majority of your time on the boat, which means you're not even seeing other kids, much less having a relationship with them. Was there some innate desire that was present in your mind and your heart that you knew you were missing out on something? Or how did you know that I want to go to school, I want to have friends, when the opportunity for it was not even there?
So there were brief moments where I saw this enough to kind of understand what it was like. So, for example, we were in Hawaii for a little while. And during that time in Hawaii, I wasn't allowed to go to school. I think my parents were kind of worried either it was going to cost money for us to go to school, or maybe they were worried about our passports or something. But for whatever reason, we weren't allowed to go to school. So we were hanging around every day. But I did meet other kids. I met some other kids in the boatyard, and, we would hang around. I remember us going kind of roller skating and so on. So you would meet kids here and there.
Yeah.
Occasionally you'd meet other kids on other boats. But the problem was you kind of meet them, you spend a couple of days together, and then you go. And then the vast amount of time you kind of didn't. I read every book that I could lay my hands on. And every time we got to a port, my mother would change over. We had about 20, 30 books on board. She'd change over the books with whichever book she could find in a charity shop. So it was a pretty random mix of books. But you would pick up stuff in those books, kind of one way or another. So I knew what I was missing. I absolutely kind of knew what I was missing and kind of what I wanted, which was, a much more normal kind of childhood.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think I was naive. I mean, I knew, there's bad stuff that can happen in those sorts of worlds, but at least I would have friends and at least I would be learning. I had this kind of great craving for education.
Were there things that you wanted to learn, but you didn't have access to learn?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I always had a kind of scientific bent. That was always kind of where I kind of ended up kind of going in that direction. So I remember sitting, and I could describe this at one point when I'm writing about it. I remember sitting in Hawaii actually, and my head was full of questions, so how is wood made? What's in the air? Kind of what happens when you breathe? Why is the sea so much colder than the air around us? I mean, all these kind of questions, and there was nobody I could ask. I'd never been in a library. While I was in Hawaii, we got at one point for a short amount of time one of those little tiny portable televisions that my father got because he liked watching cowboy movies. But once he'd fallen asleep, I would watch it, and I got to watch two things that I fell in love with. One was The Muppet Show, which is a fantastic program. Mm-hmm. But also I watched Cosmos, which is this program by a scientist called Carl Sagan. And he would, in each episode, describe some sort of scientific mystery. I remember one about the Library of Alexandria. And this kind of opened up this little window, if you like, to this world where there was just this incredible amount of knowledge if you could get hold of it. And I had a huge craving to kind of find that knowledge. And also, as I got older, I began to realize that if I could teach myself somehow, that would be an escape route from this boat, which was increasingly a bit like a prison.
Yeah. So you're thinking education that's what's going to get me out of the boat. And you're talking about, at this time, 11, 12, 13. Originally, this was a 3-year journey. So when did you realize, hey, this isn't going to be 3 years?
Well, when we were in Hawaii and I was 11, 12, we had a family vote because that was supposed to be the end of the voyage. So Captain Cook on his third voyage, which we were supposed to be following, although it was a pretty kind of loose thing by that point. We weren't really going to the places that he'd gone to. But anyway, it was the excuse for the voyage. He was killed in Hawaii on his third voyage. So that was supposed to be the end. And then we were supposed to come back through the Panama Canal and come back to the UK. And my father said, we're going to have a vote on whether we're going home or whether we're going to keep sailing.
A vote. Okay.
A vote. And so I talked to my younger brother, and we both voted to go home. I mean, I was desperate to kind of come back and to go to school, friends, all the things that we've kind of talked about. My parents both voted to keep sailing. And then my father announced, despite the fact that he'd always maintained that this voyage was something we'd all decided to do, that had always been the kind of myth on the boat, he suddenly announced, well, it's a split vote. I'm the captain. I get the deciding vote, and we're going to keep sailing. And so from that point on, I knew I was trapped on this boat. I had no ability to make a decision because I'd been very clear I wanted to go home, and he'd completely overruled us.
Yeah. What was your relationship with your mother and your father like, and how did it change with that decision?
So I was always much closer to my father than my mother. My mother was not a very maternal mother, not a very kind of warm person. And my relationship with my mother became much worse after I was about kind of 11, 12, and I started to become a teenager. I don't know why. I think she saw me as somehow kind of competing for attention or for my father's attention, or who knows what was going on. But the way in which it manifested itself was she would kind of call me names, and she would, kind of banish me off into the kind of other end of the boat. And it was just very, the relationship was very unpleasant. And continued that way. It was pretty consistently unpleasant from that kind of point onwards, sometimes much worse and sometimes kind of okay. There were long periods, sometimes weeks, when she wouldn't speak to me directly on the boat. She would only speak to me through other people. Can you tell that girl to go and do this? And that's very hard to deal with when you're in such a confined environment.
Well, especially when neither of you have other relationships, or at least very many options for other relationships.
Exactly. It's kind of terrible because you can't leave, you can't go to a friend's house, you can't do anything. So the only thing that I could do was retreat into myself, and just try to, say as little as possible to her to try and avoid her kind of attacking me. My relationship with my father was much better in that, he was warmer to me. And we would, I remember we used to have kind of jokes, and, I remember taking my teddy bear up on deck when he was on watch, and we would kind of chat. But with my father, it was always very conditional. This was his voyage and he was going to do it his way, and he would never change any of that. But he was a warmer person kind of day to day in my life than my mother was.
So at this point, when the vote happens, you're how old, 13 or so?
I'm about 12, I think, when the vote happens.
And so y'all set, at that point, you were originally going to go through the Panama Canal back home to England.
So instead we turn around, and instead of going east through the Panama Canal, we go west and sail all the way back down the Pacific to Australia. And it becomes apparent to me that my father has no intention of ever finishing this voyage. He's just going to keep on sailing. I mean, he's fallen in love with this idea of being the captain of a boat, taking these crew on board to earn money. I'm cooking and cleaning with my mother to kind of, support that. And somehow that's keeping this going. I eventually managed to convince my parents to let me enroll in a correspondence course, in a schooling by post. And I start trying to teach myself. By this point, I'm about 14, 15. And I'm starting to try and teach myself. But it's very difficult on the boat because there's very limited space. There's only one small table. And most of the time, I'm not allowed to use it because it's being used by the crew. I'm obviously working down below. My relationship with my mother, as I say, is quite bad. So I'm kind of trying to hide from her quite a lot of the time. And also, of course, if you're doing correspondence, you need a post office because you've got to post the stuff off and get it back. And it was always very unclear when we were going to get to a post office and when we were going to go to another one. And you're kind of trying to work in the scraps of time that you have at sea.
How do you receive correspondence when you're on the boat?
So when I would send stuff off, say we were in, Vanuatu, I would say to my father, "Where are we going to next, Dad?" And he would go, "Oh, we're probably going to Fiji." So I would post my stuff off in Vanuatu, and I'd say, send all the lessons back to Poste Restante, the main post office in Tahiti. But the problem was that, you never quite knew when you were going to get to Tahiti. The post office would only keep the post for a certain amount of time, then they'd send it back. Sometimes my dad would just change his mind, or we would get there and he wouldn't want to wait around for the post to arrive. So I'd say I got less than half of it back, but I got some of it back. And I was just determined that this was going to be my escape route. I think there was two reasons. One, I thought if I could educate myself, I could get off this boat and create my own life. And then the other thing was, in a world where I had very few things that I could control, although I was living, as I say, in this beautiful, world in many ways, and we would see whales and dolphins and all the things that you would expect. And in many ways, that was wonderful. But the reality of my world was I couldn't control anything. But my education, I could control. When I opened up a book and I started studying, that was something that I had a small amount of control over.
I mean, you've talked about the physical beauty of the world and the environment a few times, and it seems like a really small consolation given all of these other negative things that you're experiencing. If you don't have loving, meaningful human relationships, you don't have control over you don't have agency over your own life. I'm not sure that being in a physically less beautiful environment would have really made it that much worse.
Yeah, I really agree with you. And I mean, the reason why I say it is for the whole of my life since I escaped from the boat, when I've said to people, I grew up on a boat, and they say, well, where? And I say, well, mainly the South Pacific. People will say, well, that's amazing. What an amazing childhood. You must have seen whales and dolphins. And yes, I did. And you must have seen islands that most people don't get to see. And yes, I did. And, I've seen, different cultures and different people that people wouldn't get to experience. And all of that is true. And all of that I kind of took something from. But you're completely correct. What I paid for that, the things that I lost were far, far greater. I lost any autonomy, friendships, the ability to go to school, the ability to kind of get away from a kind of family dynamic, which became really bad over the years.
Yeah, and it certainly sounds like it became more than even just bad. I think what you're describing when people talk to you, oh my gosh, you grew up on this boat, it was probably so pretty, it was so amazing. It reveals something about the lens through which we view travel itself. For most people, they live a fairly routine life, a fairly quote unquote normal life, the one that you wished that you had when you were on the boat. And travel is something that's voluntary. It's something that begins and ends with what we see and consume. It's not what we do or accomplish. When people talk about their travels, they went somewhere to see something. They talk about the sights, the pictures, the food. It's not about the travels. I went here to study, or I went here for business, or I went here for, whatever. I had to do something. No, it was what I consumed, what I saw. And I think people really overweight the value of that, because there's something within us that recognizes when we go do something so grand, I mean, gosh, it must have been important. If I went to Fiji, I mean, there must have been something that I really gained from that, because otherwise that's a lot of time and money and effort for what? And so we overweight it. And it reveals to them, well, wait a second, if you saw the beautiful whales and the animals and the trees and the water, how could it not have been good? But it wasn't, because the most important thing in life is so far away from what we see and what we consume. It's what we do and what we build and what we create. And if you don't have that, you don't have the ability to create, you don't have the ability to build, you don't have the meaningful connections, then what you consume is meaningless.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, the things that a child needs, and I've thought a lot about it, the things that a child needs in a family are, unconditional love, which I never had. They need their parents to be there, kind of for the important moments, but they need friendships, they need education, they need to have fun. They just need to have fun. And for a kid, it's not fun just to be in a beautiful place. I mean, we very rarely stopped and did things which were fun for a kid, and fun for a kid is going on a water slide, going out and kind of hanging out with your friends for the evening, all those sorts of things. Those are fun for a kid, not just sitting on a boat in a beautiful bay with palm trees around it with a bunch of adults that you don't really want to talk to. So you're right. I think traveling is not just about being in nice places. Traveling is about, for me, I still love traveling, by the way. I don't sail very much anymore, but I still love traveling, and I travel with my kids. I have 3 kids of my own now. And the really wonderful thing about traveling is, first of all, now when I travel, I have agency. I can decide what I want to do and what I don't want to do. I'm not trapped. But also I'm traveling with people who I love and care about. And traveling is a wonderful way to spend time with people who you care about. So it's completely different to my experience on the boat. You know, I go on a holiday with my children and I get to spend time with them. We get to see things together. We get to talk about it, go for dinner together. You know, that's just a completely different experience to being trapped in a world where you have no agency, no friendships, and, you know, no way to escape, and nobody who you can talk to who will take any great account of what your needs are.
And you've used that word escape several times. What did that escape ultimately look like?
Well, eventually my parents, when I was 16 and my brother was 15, we got to New Zealand and my parents basically left the two of us there and sailed away. My brother got into a school and I was still trying to teach myself by correspondence whilst being tasked with looking after him. There was always a kind of dynamic that, you know, my brother, he was the kind of favored child, so he had to be kind of looked after, and I was the kind of disfavored child, so I had to kind of do the looking after. But I was determined to get myself away, and so I spent that year, as well as looking after my brother, still studying, and then I wrote to every university I'd ever heard of in the world. So I wrote to Harvard University, Harvard America, and Auckland University, Auckland, New Zealand, and Oxford University, England. And it was all the elite universities in particular, not because I thought I was particularly elite, but because those were the only ones I'd ever heard of on a boat.
Sure.
And I didn't have any addresses because I had no way to find the addresses out. So Harvard, for example, never wrote back. And I now realize that Harvard University, Harvard America is not the right address. It's not actually in Harvard. And most of the other universities did not write back. Or well, they wrote back and said no. So, you know, Sydney wouldn't take me because I wasn't Australian, and New Zealand wouldn't take me because I wasn't a Kiwi. You know, London University wouldn't take me because they just thought I was too strange. But then incredibly, Oxford University wrote back and said, okay, can you write us a couple of essays? And so I did. And I wrote them a couple of really crazy essays, crazy topics. One was about how do you do science while living on a boat, for example. And I deliberately did that because I thought, well, nobody else is going to write this essay. And therefore, I've got a chance of being at least unusual. And then they wrote back and they said, if you can get here, we'll interview you. So I went and picked kiwi fruit, earned enough money for a one-way ticket to the UK. And after my parents arrived back, a week after they arrived back, you know, so that they could look after my brother, I got on a plane with a one-way ticket and flew to the UK to get myself into university. And I didn't have a plan B, which I kind of look back now and think there was no plan B.
This time where your parents have left you in New Zealand, first of all, how long of a period was this, and where were y'all living? How did you have anywhere to live?
So they left us for 9 months in New Zealand, and they had rented a small holiday hut. It was very, very basic. The initial idea had been that my father was going to stay with us, but at the last minute he decided my mother was going to keep sailing with another skipper to earn money on the boat. And then at the last minute, he just upped and left the two of us kids kind of looking after ourselves. So they didn't come back for 9 months. And in the book, that is the bleakest kind of mental period of this whole kind of story, because I'm on my own. I'm only 16. I've never been away from the boat before. And you know, I don't know how to kind of cope, but somehow I do get through it. I get through it, and I get myself back to the UK. I do this interview. Incredibly, I get a place, and then I go. You know, I'm able to kind of go to university. It's not quite as straightforward as that, and I kind of finish the book the day I walk through and kind of start at university. Of course, you know, it wasn't quite so straightforward. It was very difficult, kind of reintegrating into society, particularly socially. I found it really difficult. And my parents also disowned me shortly after I went to Oxford. because they didn't want to pay for anything. So I was very broke.
Did you know that that was going to be their reaction before you made the trip to Oxford?
No, I thought they would help to fund me, and they had promised they would. But they always had a really odd thing about money. And so they found a kind of excuse to, basically stop funding me. So I was very broke. I ended up getting a hardship grant from my college, which was very kind of them. But I concealed for quite a long time that I had no money because I was very frightened that Oxford would throw me out if they discovered that I was broke. And of course, I'd sacrificed everything to get there. Every moment when I wasn't required to do work on the boat, I'd been studying. So I'd sacrificed everything to get there, and I wasn't going to throw it away. But despite all of that, it changed my life. Oxford, the fact that they gave me an offer, and they took a real bet on me, because I turned up from the South Pacific with no normal British qualifications, and they took a bet on me. And then I went from there. I did a PhD at Cambridge. I went and worked in the UK government. I went to McKinsey, became a consultant. Now I work for a company called Exor, which is a kind of family-backed business. And my life is just completely different to how it would have been if I hadn't have escaped from that boat.
Well, it certainly paid off. But when your parents said, hey, we're not going to send you any money, was it a condemnation of your behavior? You've done something wrong and therefore we're not going to pay? Or is it some other convoluted excuse as to why they didn't have the money?
So my mother would always pick rows with me over little tiny things that I did. And actually in my diaries, they disowned me 3 times. They did it kind of repeatedly. But the worst one, the final one, was they wanted me to go and meet my brother when he came back eventually to England. And I wasn't able to, because for my degree, I had to be on a field course when he was due to be there. And I went to my tutor, and my tutor said, if you go, you can't finish the course. It's a mandatory course. You can't go. And nobody had met me when I came back to the UK. So I just arrived and so I rang up my parents and said, look, I'm really sorry, but I can't meet my brother. And this is why. And they disowned me. I don't really think it was about that. I think they didn't want to pay the money, and they were always very short of money, or at least they believed they were very short of money. It was hard to earn money on the boat. But I still think it was an incredibly mean thing to do, because they could have done it. They certainly did it for my brother. And that is a period in your life, and I'm now very conscious of it as a parent. When your children are that age, having no money, being incredibly broke, is, made my time at university really, really, really difficult. I mean, I was literally hungry for quite a lot of my time at kind of university. So it was a very kind of mean thing to do. And it made me really reflect when I became a parent on, what are the things which are reasonable to do and not reasonable to do. And, that's definitely in the category of not reasonable.
My dad has a similar experience with respect to the money in college that he's shared on the podcast before, where basically all of a sudden, halfway through, the money stopped and there was no real reason for it. There was no warning. There was no explanation. It wasn't so much that, he had done something wrong or anything, or that case was even attempted to be made, but all of a sudden he had no money. And he, ever since I was little, he would tell me the stories of that. How he would go to the happy hours at local bars because all the bars had free food for happy hour. Well, he would sneak in, not buy any alcoholic drinks, and then just eat the nachos and then go home. He would talk about how he would only go to the restroom on campus at school because he didn't want to have to buy his own toilet paper. And on his last day of school, he didn't have enough money to get gas in his car to come back home. And so he sold his textbooks, and that was enough to fill his tank with gas. And he came back home just the way he started, with not a single penny. And that shapes you.
Yeah, it shapes you. It does. I mean, what I did, I had almost no money. So what I did was, first of all, I couldn't ever socialize because that required money. So it has a kind of big impact on you in that sort of way. The biggest issue was food because I couldn't afford food. So a bit like your dad, how do you solve this? And I worked out that if I bought one bag of dried pasta and one can of tomatoes, I could feed myself for a week. So 1/5 of the can of tomatoes and 1/5 of the bag of pasta every night was just about enough to get from Monday to Friday. And then on a Friday, I remember my treat was a hazelnut yogurt. That was the kind of Friday treat. And I look back and I think, that's terrible. I mean, that's just awful. And I wish now that I had gone to my college earlier and said, can I do something? I mean, the other thing that I did is I worked out every single prize that I could apply for. Because nobody ever bothered applying for the essay prizes in my college because they weren't worth very much. You'd have to write like a 20-page essay and then they would give you a £20 prize, if you won. But the good thing was that nobody ever bothered. So I just entered all of them.
You win by default.
Kind of won by default. I entered a science writing prize in the newspapers and won some money. So I found all these different ways. In the holidays, I figured out every holiday a way to kind of somewhat fund, because the summers were a real problem. What are you going to do in the summer when you've got no home to go to? Because my parents were still on the boat and I had no money. So one year I volunteered to be a research assistant and, that meant that I got a little bit of money. Another year I raised funds to lead an expedition and I went to kind of Africa and looked at butterflies, but that also meant that I was fed, which was great. It completely shapes you, and it shapes how you behave as a parent, and it shapes how you think about kind of money. And I've never wanted to be the sort of person who is, that mean with money that kind of people around me really suffer from it.
Yeah, it's a tool, and a lot of it can be overcome. And I don't know if this would have solved this for your parents and for you in your situation, because there's obviously a lot of other intrapersonal issues that were at play. But one of the biggest ways to solve it is just talk about it as a family. And when I hear you talk about the money problems that your family experience, it sounds like not communicating about them was one of the major problems. And what's odd is that it's often a symptom of a lack of money, but then it becomes a cycle. We don't really have the money, but we also don't want to tell our daughter that we don't have the money. And so we're never going to acknowledge that we don't have the money. Well, now she's gone off and she's going to an expensive private university. Whoopsies. Now we're in trouble. And so we've got to come up with some reason why the money isn't there, instead of just saying, even at that point, hey, we don't have the money. Hey, we're not going to provide the money. Because once you start concealing, people will make decisions based on information they thought they had. And I see that happen on less extreme examples. A family might not want to talk to their children about money, but they really can't afford for their kid to go to Vanderbilt. And then the kid goes and applies and he gets into Vanderbilt, and they go, well, we certainly can't tell him now. Right. So they either find some way for him to have broken a rule so they can justify not giving it, or they end up going into debt themselves and making a horrible decision for themselves because they can't tell their child, hey, we should have told you back when you were 14 that we couldn't afford this. Or worse, they just cut the funds off with no explanation. And it's tragic because a lot of us bring to the table all sorts of feelings of shame and guilt and maybe a lack of knowledge or whatever it is that related to money that make it harder to talk about. But simply by being open with it, you're going to avoid being mean in the way that you experience.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in my family, you could never talk about money. My father would react in a extremely aggressive way if you attempted to talk about money. Because, one of the things about living on a boat is you can create the impression that you're incredibly successful. There you are on a boat, and our boat actually, although she became very tired over time, so if you lived on her, you could see that. I mean, eventually her keel was actually bent. The woodwork was all kind of, peeling, and, the equipment was breaking, but she was still a very beautiful boat if you looked at her, particularly kind of standing on the shore. And my father could create this world where he looked successful. But in reality, they had very little money. And what money they had, they certainly didn't want to kind of spend on, kind of give away to somebody else. They wanted to kind of use that. So in some ways, I understand that. What I find much harder to understand is that they wouldn't talk about it. It was very aggressive. They certainly kind of cut me off with, they made an excuse, but it was a kind of made up, it was a made up excuse.
Yeah.
And they did fund my brother. They funded my brother. I know that they had enough money to keep sailing and do other things. So I think sometimes, what I've kind of realized as a parent is that there are points in your children's life where money makes a massive difference, allowing your child. And by the way, the UK universities are not that expensive, so I wasn't paying for fees because I'd managed to get those covered. It was literally money for food was what I needed. So we're not talking kind of vast sums. But that makes a massive difference, if you care about your children. So you've got to have your kind of priorities slightly odd if you're going to kind of put other things above that.
I see families this is exacerbated in your family by the circumstances, but I see people in other situations who prioritize status. And when you prioritize status, you necessarily are prioritizing the perception of status, because part of status is the perception. And when that is a tenet of your value hierarchy, if it's at the top of the list or close to the top of the list of your value hierarchy, you're going to make very, very challenging decisions about money, because a lack of money can negatively impact that perception of status, which can therefore negatively impact your real true status. And so when people value that, it's such a losing game. And if your parents were in a situation where they valued status, they wanted to appear as if they had money, then any time where they didn't, being open and vulnerable and talking about it and communicative was the absolute worst thing to do. It was the only thing that was going to solve the money problem, but it was also the biggest threat to the actual perception of status, which was the important thing to protect. I think that's a very common experience.
It's very interesting. It also means that you spend the money on the wrong things. So you spend the money on the things that preserve the status. So in my parents' case, my parents both drank very heavily, which is quite common in kind of sailing families, very heavily. So there was always a massive supply of alcohol on the boat. And that's very important for status in a kind of sailing world, because people would come on board, you would give them lots of drinks, you would be successful, you were being kind of generous with the alcohol. So a lot of money was being spent on things that preserve the status, rather than actually kind of things which are frankly much more important for your family than spending the money on the alcohol, like, kind of giving your kids money to kind of pay for food. And that, for me, is a real problem. The boat was a symbol of status, so my father would, much prefer to pay to buy something for the boat, even something that wasn't an essential thing for the boat, but, kind of a nice additional kind of, painting something on the boat, or kind of adding something to the boat, or a new kind of piece of woodwork for the boat. I don't remember him ever buying me a new piece of clothing as a child. All my child clothing was secondhand. So I think kind of status makes you make strange choices about how you spend money, because you spend money on the things that make you look good.
Yeah, and the status symbols necessarily and inherently are things that are not good investments. They're depreciating assets almost exclusively. I mean, if you think of like a diamond ring that a groom would give to his potential bride, right? Why do we give a diamond ring? People will criticize it. Well, it's wasteful. It's not really that useful of a stone anyway. It's overvalued. It's not worth the money. Well, yeah, but like that's why we do that. Before diamond rings, we gave big bouquets of flowers, and we'd sacrifice a farm animal, or you'd give a bunch of meat. The cavemen would give piles and piles of meat, because more meat than could be consumed, because to waste was to display wealth. I have so much that I can afford to waste. And that's what a status symbol is I have so much I can afford this very expensive car that certainly exceeds the minimum requirements for transportation. I can afford this very nice expensive alcohol to give to other people. I'm not even going to drink it myself. I'm going to give it to others. That's the essence of a status symbol, and that's the tricky game that you find yourself playing when you chase status. Is ultimately, of course, it's meaningless, and it's not going to be a fulfilling identity. But two is that it's going to cause you to spend money on things that make it harder and harder and harder to maintain that status.
Yeah, much, much better in life to, do things which are meaningfully good things. However you want to define kind of good things, whether it's being a kind of good parent, a good employee, setting up a business that's successful, kind of being good with your employees, doing good in your community. These aren't status symbols. These are things that you're genuinely doing, which are because you believe that they're good things to do. And often they involve personal sacrifice, and sometimes they will decrease your status or kind of risk decreasing your status. But fundamentally, long term, these are things which are, going to, even if you were doing it to kind of care about it, I think kind of long term, if you do that successfully, people are going to respect you much more than the kind of superficial shows of status. But you're right, it is, at one level, it is inherent in human society to kind of value that. You found that in the Pacific, that there were extraordinary examples of this. When you, some of the islands, when you got married, you would give people a feather cloak, a cloak made of the feathers of rare birds. Or of there's another kind of culture where people would give necklaces of shells that had been sanded into little beads that went on the necklace. Took many, many, many hours to produce, and of course both are useless. Both are, apart from looking very beautiful. So I don't mind some of that. We do that. That's kind of inherent in human nature to want to, wear nice clothes and sit in a nice place and kind of, enjoy and display some of the things that we've worked hard for, but not when it gets in the way of behaving as a good human being. And that's where it becomes difficult.
What happened to your dog?
So I eventually got back to the UK, and of course I didn't know how to find Rusty. I didn't know where Rusty was. I now know actually that Rusty was still alive when I got back, but sadly I never saw Rusty again, because by the time I tracked down where Rusty was, Rusty had sadly passed away. Although the good news about him is that apparently he went on to have a very happy life after we left. He was given to a family who looked after him, who also had a cat. And Rusty fell madly in love with the cat. And Rusty and the cat had a kind of long and very kind of happy relationship. And I think Rusty and the cat kind of died very close to each other. I've now kind of talked to the son from that family. So there's a little bit of kind of, I'm very happy that Rusty had a good life. I'm kind of sad I never saw him again. He was a very, very lovely dog who I was very close to as a small child. And by the time I got back, my kind of doll's house had, basically kind of fallen apart. So most of what we left had gone by the time I got back. There was very little. And of course, I didn't really have much of a relationship with the rest of my family because I hadn't seen them since I was 7 years old. But what I've been able to go on and do in my life is then create my own life. I now have as I mentioned before, kind of 3 kids. I got married. I was married for many years. Sadly, my husband passed away a few years ago. I've been able to create my own career, which I've enjoyed a kind of huge amount. Now I'm writing books. So you can create your own world. It's just much harder to do that when you're starting from such a difficult background.
It's kind of tragically poetic that you and Rusty had this divergence and then seemingly lived entirely separate lives. Obviously, I know he's a dog and you're a human, but he got wonderful, meaningful connection with the cat while you were trapped. And the story starts where it looks like he's getting the raw end of the deal, getting abandoned. My last question for you, Suzanne, what's your top decision-making tip for business owners?
So my top tip is to always try and pause and think about the counter argument. Now, some people call this kind of putting on the kind of black hat, but effectively, if you're deciding to make a decision, say to make an investment or buy another company or, something that's kind of meaningful, it's actually worth tasking somebody to come up with all the arguments why it's a bad idea. Just tell them to go away and kind of either write it down or come and tell you all the reasons why it's a really bad idea, and really listen to them and then decide. Because what we tend to do as humans is we tend to only listen to the reinforcing points. So if I really want to buy that business or that house or that dress, frankly, I will only look at things that kind of reinforce my point of view. It's a very natural thing. So you kind of deliberately have to turn that on its head to get someone to tell you the opposite and then make a decision, and you're more likely to have thought about it in a more measured way.
That's great. Book, Wave Walker. Geez, I got tongue tied on that. Wave Walker. It's a fantastic read. Thanks for being here, Suzanne. Where can people connect with you and the work that you're doing?
So they can find me on LinkedIn. They can find me everywhere, actually. Find me on Facebook, find me on X. I'm on all social media. So they do kind of connect. And I'd love to see what some of your podcast listeners are doing. I know they're all doing really interesting stuff.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My takeaway from our conversation with Suzanne was we're all in some ways, or at least for brief periods, stuck on our own boat. We're somewhere where we don't want to be and we want to get off. Maybe you're not there now, but you've been there. Maybe you are there now. Maybe you'll be there in the future. Either way, wanting to get off the boat is not good enough. You've got to want to do something that's off the boat. And so in Suzanne's case, it was education. Now, that was her ticket off the boat, but it was some positive action versus simply escaping. She knew what she wanted to do. She knew who she wanted to become. And if you're stuck on the boat, whether the boat is your business, your job, the area you live in, wanting to escape is fine. But who do you want to become when you escape? That question will be the difference in whether you ever get off the boat.
You just made a great decision to listen to this episode of Decidedly. Make another great decision by subscribing to the show and leaving us a review wherever you're listening. We appreciate the support. It helps business owners like you find our community and defeat bad decision-making in their own lives. For more decision-making insights, check us out at decidedlypodcast.com, on Instagram at decidedlypodcast, or grab a copy of Sanger and Sean's books from the links in the show notes. Finally, we'd like to thank Shelby Peterson of Transcend Media for editing and post-production of the show. Thanks for listening. I'm Morgan, your producer, and this is Decidedly.